Okay, so today we're just going to be talking about the GoPro Hero 9, any GoPro really, and shutter speeds, frame rates, and looking at the 180-degree shutter rule, natural motion blur, and then also the effects of stabilization, and really what you should be choosing or considering when going through your settings. So right now we have 4K 60 frames per second with a shutter of 1/120. Now I've used an ND filter on here, an ND16. And so technically this is our 180-degree shutter rule. And if you compare it to the previous video, which we'll do in a minute, you'll notice that the bat movement is much smoother. So when we look at that 4K 60 with an auto shutter, it's a little more robotic, or you can see it more fractured, where the 4K 60 with the 120 is much smoother. So this is what they're talking about when people tell you about that cinematic look. Now here's the problem though. When we do that shutter of 1/120, then we get this judder and this kind of jello effect, and not as good a stabilization when we start moving. So right here I have the camera, it's on the El Grande, and I'm just chasing my kid around with the camera on the stick. Now compare that to an auto shutter here, and you can see that the stabilization is much better, it's much crisper, more clean. But then again, when we look at his legs and the movement, we might question, does it look as smooth, does it look as good? And then we can look at the comparison here. Now, one of the things that you'll notice if you look at the dirt, you'll see how it kind of slides by on the 120 shutter, whereas on the auto shutter it's more detailed as he's moving around.
Run a second.
So now we're going to go into cinematic settings. And so here we go. Danny's running, and I put a bleach bypass look over the image to give it that cinematic look. But everything is just in an auto setting.
Nice job. That looked pretty good, Danny.
Yeah. Was it cinematic?
No, I didn't have the cinematic setting on.
What the heck?
Oh, let's put it on the cinematic setting with an ND filter and see if that's better.
How do you forget that?
Okay, so now we're going to first do it with a 30 frames per second, and we'll do the 180 shutter rule, and you can already see the stabilization is falling apart. We're getting a lot of that blur. And then the question is, does this really look that much better, or does it look worse than the previous video? It is a lot brighter because I had to manually set the shutter, and the ND filter isn't quite dark enough. But here we go again, and now we're going to do a 24 frames per second with a shutter of 1/48. And this really just does not look good, in my opinion. As far as when we're talking about with this stabilization, there's just too much blur in my opinion. So yeah, you hear a lot of 24 frames per second and the 180-degree shutter rule. Personally, I just don't think it looks that great. So right here we're going to go ahead and take a look at all three of them, and then you can just make a decision for yourself. If I was to choose one, I'd probably go with the auto, or I'd go with the 5K 30. Maybe even with the shutter of 1/120, but definitely not that 5K 24. And then here, this is interesting. This is just 2.7K with 120 frames per second and just an auto shutter. And here it was with a flat color profile, so here I'm adding in some color grading to it. Now we're trying to make it look a little more cinematic, so I'm going to add the bars in here, a little slow motion, and then we're going to add the bleach bypass. And so here is 2.7K, 120 frames per second with an auto shutter. And is this cinematic? Probably not the most cinematic shot, but as you can see, you can still make it look pretty cinematic, if you will. Nice hit, Danny. So what we're gonna start talking about now is really motion blur in and of itself, and also doing any frame grabs. And so we're just going to run through a bunch of different frames with different shutters and ND filters, and then you can see what you're going to get with each different shutter at each different speed here. This one now we're going to get into is the 180-degree shutter rule. And as you'll see a little bit later, it's still got a little too much blur in my mind. And then here's 1/30, which is obviously way too slow. And then finally we'll just go into the auto shutter here. Now on our first frame grab, this is why we want a little bit of motion blur, because it's hard to tell that he's even moving at all. And that continues on even here as we slow the shutter down to 1/240. However, you're getting a little blur, and then what I think actually looks probably the best is this 1/120. Now, maybe not so much for a frame grab if I want it to be crisp, but as we go over here to the 1/60, which is your 180-degree rule, it's just too blurry for a frame grab, in my opinion. And then, of course, the 1/30 is just a blurry mess. And then finally, in good lighting, we have our auto shutter, and it looks fine. Great for a frame grab if we want detail, but there's no motion being given out. Now, as far as shutter speed though, do we really need the 180-degree shutter rule? So we're going to look at 4K 60 and 4K 30. And what the key here is going to be, is there really a difference with the relationship between frames and shutter? So we just saw 4K 30 with a shutter of 1/60, and then here is our 4K 60 with a shutter of 1/60, and as you can tell, the blur is pretty much the exact same. And then we can go to the extreme on that, and we'll do a shutter of 1/120 in both 4K 30 and 4K 60, and we're going to see that that's pretty much the exact same result again as far as the same amount of blur. So what I say is, it's not so much that you need to concern yourself with 180-degree shutter rules when you're doubling your frame rate. It's just having an idea of what kind of blur you're going to get with what shutter speed. I'm not against ND filters, but you should know what you're going to get, and really what you want to focus on is your shutter speed, not so much the frames per second, and then you'll have an idea of what you're going to get. Now, shutter speed is very, very important when it comes to stabilization. Now, here's what it looks like with no stabilization at all, with just an auto shutter, but stabilization turned off. And then on these next shots, we're going to use just the high, no boost on the stabilization. I did want to have some shake in here, and he's wearing the junior chesting. It was actually kind of loose. We had a hard time tightening it down on him. It's the older one. But as you can see here, with a shutter of 1/60, it's just kind of a blurry mess, and the stabilization isn't so hot. When we go to a shutter over 1/20, it's a little clearer and crisper, and we do get some motion blur, so it's not too bad. Stabilization is a little bit better. 1/240 is generally where you need to be at a minimum to have good stabilization, and you can see that it's improving better, but where you can really see that faster shutter come in is right here with a shutter of 1/480, and that's just a world of difference between the other ones. Now we'll do it again, this time in 4K 60, and once again it's really more about the shutter than it is the frames per second. The frames per second matters on the slow motion, keeping it smooth, but as far as stabilization itself, 30 versus 60 frames per second, and you're pretty much getting the same amount of blur and the same amount of stabilization between the two. As you can see right here, the blur is the same, stabilization is pretty much the same. Shutter again is the factor, not so much the frames per second. Then we'll finally end it here, just looking at frames per second when we go to do slow motion. Now, right here we have an auto shutter. I did a little color grading on this shot right here, but we're going to go ungraded for the rest here with a flat color profile. Now this is 2.7K, 120 frames per second with a shutter over 1/120, which is as slow as you can go. And the water's coming out and it's really smooth and it's all together. You don't really see a lot of droplets or splitting of the water. As we speed up our shutter, you're starting to see the water get a little bit more defined as it's breaking down, and this is going to get even stronger and stronger as we increase the shutter speed. Now at 480, water is very, very clear, and you can start to really make out each water droplet. But we still have two more levels to go here, and here's 1/960. And he's grabbing that water, and you can really see those water droplet comes. Now, there are times when you want it to look very fluid and smooth, and that's why we slow down the shutter. But then there's other times where you want it really crisp, really detailed. An example comes to mind. I remember a guy was recording himself with his golf swing, and he was frustrated because it was very blurry. And so the suggestion I gave to him was to increase that shutter speed and improve his lighting, and he was then able to get much better detail and was much happier with his camera that way. And you can see the difference in the water right here, and then even in the freeze frame here of the water droplets. So hopefully this will help you out in deciding what frame rate to use and what shutter speed, and to have a better understanding of how they all relate together. Please subscribe and like if this helped you. Feel free to dislike if it didn't, but please leave a comment down below. Let me know what you did, you didn't like, and also what you'd like to see in future videos. Until the next one, thank you much. See you later.